Well, I've got four estimable panellists here. Let me introduce you to them before I start talking. On the far end there, Rob Mason, Managing Director of IMG Consulting. Helena Morrissey, CBE, the Chief Executive Officer of Newton Investment Management, sponsors of the women's boat race. Bill Sweeney, Chief Executive Officer of the British Olympic Association. And lastly, but not least, Martin Whitmarsh, who's Chief Executive of Land Rover BAR, that's Ben Ainslie Racing. So, our panel today is entitled Opportunities and Threats. And for those of you who've been here all day today, I thought we had quite a lot of threats that we talked about this morning. Threats of associations with sporting bodies who might be embroiled in corruption and bribery. Threats with athletes using drugs. What does a sponsor do if he finds that an athlete he's sponsoring is drugging, as seems to be a verb now? Do they stay or do they go? Another threat to sponsors has risen up over the last just day or two when the chairman of WADA suggested that sponsors and broadcasters might have to pay to get involved with the anti-doping investigations that are necessary to root out these dopers. So actually, coming from a sponsorship and consultancy background, I thought to myself, do sponsors have to pay twice all of a sudden? And I know there's been a lot of talk on Twitter about that. But almost always it comes down to, with brands, the threat is that they see an opportunity, and we'll talk about opportunities more in a moment, but they see an opportunity to get involved with sport, which they can see works for a number of other brands. But they get involved in a rush, they don't know quite what they're buying, they don't really know what they want, and they sometimes go away disappointed and don't come back, and that for the industry I think is a big loss. But that's on the threat side. On the opportunities side, I mean, we could talk endlessly about opportunities, but just to sort of paraphrase it, opportunities to reach large or small audiences, locally, globally. We've heard about globalization. Opportunities for brands to deliver specific messages to their fans through social and digital platforms. And we'll talk a bit more about that because, again, it's easy for brands to get it right, but it's just as easy for brands to get it wrong. So that's an opportunity or a threat. An opportunity for a brand to change perceptions, to change habits, to draw on the huge passion that surrounds sport, to create fans of brands, perhaps draw on patriotic fervour. We'll touch on that in a minute. And maybe also there are opportunities to change the agenda. I've mentioned that Helena sponsors women's sport, and we've heard a lot about women's sport being an opportunity for brands, and that's beginning to come to the fore. So this is just a bit of a background to everything that we might discuss, but I'm going to start off with a question that I'm going to throw at Rob first, not because he's furthest away, but just because he's down the end there. Perhaps brands might think that the biggest threat that they face at the moment is getting involved with the partnership for all the right reasons, and then finding that the rights holder that they've engaged with turns out to be embroiled in maybe corruption, charges, might not have gone through the rigours of governance, and all of a sudden they find themselves in partnership with somebody that is not really going to reflect well on their brand. So as an industry, and one that wants to encourage brands to come into our industry, how, Rob, can I throw this at you, how can we prevent that from happening? Is there any way, have you any thoughts on what might happen in the future to protect the industry against this?
Well, I think in terms of prevention, I mean, clearly, I think everyone is agreed that, well, I say everyone's agreed, I certainly feel the biggest threat to brands, if we talk about opportunities and threats, what's a threat and what's a challenge? A threat is the integrity piece. And, I think it's fair to say that probably brands, sponsor brands, indeed rights owners too, have not necessarily been ready for the sort of absolute storm of activity over the last couple of years. In the sense that, clearly for a long time, there are morality clauses in contracts. Most sponsors will inject a certain degree of due diligence in that space. But it's a bit like, I suppose, a prenuptial agreement. It's a bit unromantic when you start a partnership to spend all your time trying to talk about what might happen if it goes wrong. But I feel that certainly, there is an opportunity for the legal industry, and there are normally a few sports lawyers at these events, genuinely to look at different models for contracts, because it isn't just a case of giving the sponsor the opportunity to exit if things go wrong. Some of these major partnerships with major international governing bodies last a long time, and things go in cycles. It may well be that there's a period of time where the reputation is bad. There's some people who need to move on, and they do. But for that period of time, you cannot use those rights. It's just toxic. You can't activate and get involved. So how do you provide a mechanism to allow that to happen, but maybe to stay on board? So this is not just about how can we pull out more easily. It's about trying to find a way to adjust things if things go wrong within a legal framework. Very complex, and obviously for better minds than me to try and sort out. The second piece, and it was touched on by Lord Stevens this morning, is the growing head of steam to form some form of independent global entity that can, in his case, talking specifically about integrity, I'd actually take it a stage further than that and talk about governance too. And I remember we worked with Lord Stevens and Quest a few years ago, setting up the International Centre of Sports Security. And we sat there and said, one day, every governing body will have a kite mark on its website that says, tick, 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 or 5 stars, in the same way as other bodies are regulated and, many industries are regulated. We could see that happening at some point. So I suppose has the time come to explore models for some form of independent global body that isn't there to judge competence or even quality. It's there to judge that an organisation is well governed or has the right governance structure, or at least a perfectly acceptable governance structure. It is reasonably transparent, it does the right things with integrity, etc. So listen, it's a huge subject, but I'll throw that out there, and I think the time is right to look at that sort of model.
So, Helena, your first experience with sponsorship, I think I'm right in saying, was with the boat race. So, did you know what you were getting into? Did you find were you pleased? Were you a little bit askance when you found out exactly what you were dealing with?
Well, it was an evolutionary thing for Newton. We wanted a sporting sponsorship, and initially the opportunities that the consulting group that we used brought to us were rather traditional. They were very sort of classic, spend a lot of money for what felt to us a bit superficial. We were putting our name on a shirt, but it would have had perhaps the framework in place that you allude to, Rob. Instead, we said, well, no, we want an event that we can evolve, that we can shape, that we can change for the better. But we didn't do it all in one, it'll turn out to be 8 years for the Newton sponsorship arrangement with the women's boat race. But we didn't sign up to that in one fell swoop. We did spend time getting to understand and to know and to think about what we wanted from the sponsorship. You mentioned about, I suppose, sort of going in with your eyes open. And along the way, we did learn more about the governance of the races. There obviously in the past have been some questions over eligibility of athletes and so forth. And we didn't want to get put off by some of the things that could go wrong, going back to this idea of a prenuptial. But it was important to us that we understood more as we went through it. But obviously, ultimately, we were delighted because we went in, I suppose, perhaps it might seem a bit naive, but with a bit of a field of dreams kind of concept that if we build it, people will come, and that we would be able to drive a bigger audience, more attention, more spotlight on an event that had really been very, in the backwater.
Yeah, it was an opportunity.
Yeah, it was an opportunity.
So, Bill, when you're talking to potential sponsors of Team GB or BOA generally, what's the sort of the agenda? How do you? Because you've got the problem that your Olympics come along every 4 years, so you've got what a brand would call fallow years. What do you do in those years?
We're actually in 10 events over the 4-year period. So we have the Winter Olympics now, and we've now become a credible Winter Olympic team and squad, so that helps us a lot. Plus we're in Youth Olympics, we're in various different Youth Olympic festivals, there's now European Games. So there are a number of events that take place over the quad period, but by far and away the highest profile is the Summer Games, which is coming up in 86 days, but not counting, in Brazil, in Rio. But to follow on from Rob's point, that piece on integrity is absolutely critical. There are 206 National Olympic Committees around the world, and we're one of only 4 that do not receive any government funding. So for us, private sector funding in whichever shape or form that comes, whether it's commercial sponsorship, whether it's the usual suspects of merchandising, licensing and so on, that's really our lifeblood unless you change the entire system. And most of the stakeholders and the people involved in Olympic sport in this country want it to remain that way. It's been that way since 1905, and there's been a healthy separation between politics and sport. So I think whichever structure you come up with to safeguard integrity, to make sure you've got good governance in place, has to be pursued. And you would tend to say that it needs to be some form of independent body in order to gain the trust and keep the trust of the fans and the consumers. I think, as with most things, it revolves around money. You know, if you, I might get my numbers slightly wrong here, but I think there's something like 350,000 doping tests done a year. The average cost of a test is $800. So you do that calculation, it comes up to quite a bit of money. So where do you get it from? I don't think our sponsors would be too happy to pay that. Do you get it from, as Sir Craig mentioned, do you get it from charging a levy on broadcasting rights? Do you ask the government to step up? I don't think anyone really knows the answer now, but we need to come up with some kind of solution that enables you to have an independent, totally independent, separate body which conducts those testings to regain trust in the sport.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of talk in that direction. Martin, you've acquired a lot of very high-profile sponsors in what appears to be a fairly short space of time. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've attracted those sponsors and those brands? Why particularly those brands?
I think for a number of reasons. I think, I'm very fortunate to be involved in America's Cup. Frankly, it has not been a commercialised sport in the past. And it really, there was a change moment for the sport. I think what happened in 2013 in San Francisco changed people's perception because it became televisual. It was an exciting, fast, dynamic sport. It was inshore, so there was an audience there, very visible, and that creates the ambience of a sporting occasion. In the past, had been several miles out at sea, so it wasn't that stunning as a show. And then there was this fantastic story, and the fantastic story involved a British sailor, so Sir Ben Ainslie got on board the American boat. It was in the finals against New Zealand. It was first to 9 races. The Kiwis were up 8-1, and Ben participated in one of the sport's greatest turnarounds. So I think we've been very fortunate in that we're on that upswing. The America's Cup is the oldest sporting trophy in the world, a 160-year-old trophy that we started. We've never won, been dominated by the Americans. I think there's a great sense of now is the time, now is the opportunity to bring that trophy back. And on top of that, I think, so we have a sport which is relatively fresh. The problem for sport and big sport, it can go wrong, and we've seen it in football, athletics, in Formula One, and as a fresh new sport, we to some extent, frankly, we benefit from that. And the other thing is that we're a technical sport, so there's a balance, and it's always difficult in sport. You see it in Formula One as well, to have the challenge where you want the best athletes in the world with the best equipment in a technical sport. But one of the advantages is that what brands are looking for is to really find ways to emotionally connect with their consumer. And sport's a great way of doing that, but it has to have authenticity. It can't just be a name on a shirt. There has to be an involvement. You either have to participate in changing the event, which is I think what Helena was talking about, or in the case of our partners, Land Rover, BT, BAE Systems, they're involved in providing technology. So they're going to tell a story which, providing we achieve our objective, providing that after 165 years we bring this trophy back to this country, they will participate in that, and they will be able to tell that narrative. I think they'll be able to really create an authentic linkage with their involvement in what we're doing. And I think that gives a fresh story and a fresh angle to really emotionalise the connection between their brands and their consumers.
Sure. And how do you evaluate that for them? I mean, are you doing the evaluation for them, or are they doing the evaluation with you or on their own?
Both. I think any professional sport now, you have an obligation. You mentioned partners rushing in and signing before they've done their due diligence. Sadly, I know 20 years ago we used to experience that. I don't experience it. Not too many rush in nowadays. They have lots of advisors. They do their own measures. We help them. We do our own analysis of the TV, of the media exposure that we've either generated or project to generate. So, this whole industry has become much more professional. I mean, having, from obviously a very different sport, but having been involved, I guess, over the last 30 years, it's a whole new world. We used to be able to see a CEO, he'd make a decision, you sign the contract, and off you rushed. Sure. Very little due diligence. Now, sure. Maybe for some of the reasons that have been discussed here today, CEOs are much more cautious. I think governance in boardrooms tends to be a bit more stringent, so you have to sell it at all levels. And not generally with multinational businesses, you've got to sell it. You've got to sell the idea into central marketing, then you've almost got to go and sell it into every market, and all those businesses that are subscribing to that central marketing pool. Yeah. So they have plenty of time now to analyse the sport, the product that they're buying. It doesn't mean they get it all raised right.
Sure. Helena, as somebody who's had to evaluate what you've got out of your sponsorship, I mean, presumably you had identified the audiences that you wanted, or the audience, singular, I don't know what it was, that you wanted to get to, but how have you gone about deciding that you've done that, or you haven't done that, or...
So I think one of the challenges in all of this is, what one's talking about, if you're talking about trying to transform something and trying to engage emotionally with your audience, and obviously then that means having an impact on something that hasn't been done before, is a certain element in which you have to have a vision, not a spreadsheet. I mean, you can't preempt, you can't predict everything. You can say this emotional value is very hard to measure. Or we do use Replicon, we do monitor how many column inches we get. But I have to say that the outpouring of positive feedback that we got on the day that the women rode over the same course on the same day and watched by the same live audience couldn't really be evaluated in a sort of very technical way. We got lots of letters afterwards, but I would go and watch one of my children's sporting fixtures, and these little girls would come up to me and say, "Mrs. Morrissey, I'm now taking up rowing, I'm really excited, it was so great." And now that obviously we have to work out, does that help Newton with our business? But I think if you're trying to do something that is beyond, counting the numbers, but actually reaching, the hearts and the minds of those who you hope might not have thought of the event or might not have thought about, in this case, gender equality, that is quite hard to put a price tag on.
Sure. And Rob, when you're talking to brands and they are thinking of getting into the sports sponsorship industry or sports marketing industry, how are you advising them in terms of the results they're getting? And because I'm totally with Helena here. It didn't need to have a lot of data on a piece of paper for her to know that what Newton did was a great success. But there does need to be data looked at, and I mean, let's face it, there's a big industry of looking at data and deciding how to extrapolate exactly what you want from that.
I think, Karen, there's a room for data and there's a room for the more emotional, instinctive approach to how you evaluate, and it varies in different parts of the world too. I mean, companies in certain parts of the world just want numbers and data because that is how they work. I think in this part of the world, it's fair to say that, it was mentioned earlier, I think, by Standard Life, there's a scorecard and it's KPIs, it's objectives they have, and some of those are very qualitative objectives, they're not quantitative. It's feedback from the directors of the main divisions. Is it working well for you? That sort of stuff. I mean, it's not, it doesn't have to be pure data. And, obviously in an ideal world, yes, a company would start with its objectives pretty clear, what it wants to achieve, what it's trying to achieve. It may be a vision or it may be more specific. And then you set, or try and set, measurement approach and process to try and measure that. So that could be, very basic, or it could be very, very complicated, depending on what you're trying to do.
Sure. And we touched on the fervour, the British fervour, the passion, the emotional instinctiveness. And this is something that you've got, Bill, that you can sell in spades, I guess. You know, I mean, you know, think back to 2012 and the Olympics here, and
It wasn't bad, was it? Really?
what?
It wasn't bad, was it? Really?
It was fantastic. But you know, you need to be, obviously we need to have medal winners, but it's just the passion of the whole event. And I suspect Martin will tell us the same thing as well.
No, it's key for us. I mean, I think following on some of the comments here, we have 21 commercial partners, and I would say that each one of them uses us for a different purpose. I think one of the important things to do up front is, and we did a piece of independent research first and really defined and quantified what are we as a brand, where do we sit in the marketplace, how do we differ from a Premiership football club, how do we differ from a Premiership rugby club, what makes us unique, what makes us special, and then how do you work with commercial partners where what we have to offer really helps them to deliver on their strategic priorities. Some of them want that nationalistic fervour. You know, when we're in London 2012, when we'll be on in Rio, when we're in Pyeongchang for the Winter Olympics, we're a great unifying brand. You bring in the 4 home countries together. We're not divisive in any shape or form. One of the things about sport is it can get quite tribal. So for every person who loves a club or a team, there are a number of people that don't particularly love or worship that team. So that is definitely an asset for us. But if you look across the range of our different commercial partners, some of them it'll be just absolutely purely for employee engagement. It'll be how does an Olympian set a standard, a target which is exceptional, and how do they maintain that standard consistently 365 days a year, and how do you take those learnings across into your workforce and your employee base? Nothing to do with consumer, nothing to do with marketing. There are a smaller number of those. You'll have partners like Adidas, which are a pretty logical partner, who will use the Olympics to showcase, test innovative product, whether it's in footwear or apparel, and we'll have that going to Rio. And for them, they want to be seen as being a multi-sport brand and that can do things that other sports brands can't do. We'll then we entered into 2 sponsorships fairly recently with Aldi Supermarkets and DFS, and of course the immediate reaction is what on earth are companies like Aldi and DFS, what do they see in common with Team GB? Well, for a company like Aldi, and I won't go into all the details of it, for them enhancing Britishness for a company that's been in the UK 25 years and wanted to really get that message across, it made a lot of sense for them. But it's all measured. You know, there aren't many people that come in now and get a warm and fuzzy feeling writing a check and saying let's go for lunch and do a deal. It's really measured out. DFS, private equity owned, everything's about delivering value, and they measure that very closely.
Yeah. And you've got a medal winning hero that must aid your attracting sponsors greatly. I mean, he's a hero, like Bill's got.
No, absolutely
lots of heroes.
Ben is and I mean Ben is one of those great Olympians, obviously, and a world champion, and huge in sailing. And he's got this fantastic humility about him. So he's terrific to use in all those occasions. I think the other bit that we play on, of course, is this America's Cup was I think it was the 100 Guinea Cup. It was Queen Victoria and the Royal Squadron that challenged the world, and as this island state, we've never won it. So I think you could sense in Portsmouth last year, and I'm sure we're going to feel it again this year in Portsmouth at our World Series events, this huge feeling of a country getting behind you, and that's massively important. And I think Bill was talking about the internal motivation. So a lot of our big partners, and I saw it in my last life in Formula One, these big organisations get involved in a sports sponsorship deal, sports partnership deal, and they use it internally. They use it for messaging and showing excellence and those things. They also use it. Large companies need to continue to innovate, and they become very large. And in their normal business process, with all of the caution, the diligence that's in that, sometimes that can detract from innovation. And they can use technical sports like Formula One, like America's Cup, as really to provide innovation workshops to show internally how those businesses can really quickly innovate, bring things to market, which is relatively deregulated by comparison or unregulated by comparison to some of the industries that they're in. And that, I think that's also an important thing. But ultimately they want to measure that. They want to measure, and it's in our interest to have that measurement. You have. Helena obviously had vision and passion why she wanted to be involved in the boat race. If you're a customer of that, you can't rely on her successor, frankly, having that vision. So you've got to prepare for that. CEOs change, and you've got often the pet project of the last CEO is not the top of the priority for the news. So you've got to be ready with the data. You've got to be, you've got to have done your work to sell it into the marketing organisations, all of the operating businesses around the world. So when the new management's installed, you've got to head up a steam, and you can really go in there and hopefully renew and extend that relationship.
I'm really tempted to ask Helena. You may tell me you can't answer this, but what you did and giving over your sponsorship to cancer research, I thought was a one-off and a first, and it was very noticeable. So how are you going to follow that?
Oh, one thing at a time. Perhaps I should explain a little bit about why we've done it.
Yes, okay.
Because obviously, I mean, the title of this panel about, opportunities, threats to brands in sport. I mean, what we weren't looking to do, I obviously said this in a way already, but weren't just looking for a sort of static relationship between our name and the sport. We were looking to, if we're going to be focused on the commercial side, to enhance our brand by association of what we had done. And of course, having the gender equality was a big step forward, but it made us realise the power of sponsorship. And obviously that's something that perhaps we might talk about a little, because I think a lot of the time companies, it's still, in a world of lots of change. The previous panel obviously talked about social media and how different audiences, different cohorts, age cohorts are inspired by different things. That we felt that there was something more that we could do with the sponsorship, and we wanted to, again, sort of blaze a trail in terms of gifting, along with our parent company, BMR Mellon, the sponsorship, the title sponsorship to a charity, and one that, again, would touch a lot of people. And although it's was done quite close to the actual race this year, and it's definitely a 2-year arrangement, so we'll measure the success in terms of money raised, again, it just helped us made us feel that our brand development, in terms of doing something that had a social benefit that would be seen as value added for everybody, not just for us, would in turn pay dividends. But we'll see if others take it on. But what happens next? I mean, we've done 2 things. Maybe we can have a year off then. Someone else will copy.
Obviously, women's sport and investing in women's sport. I mean, we've been talking about that for years, and thank goodness you came along and did it. If I just went along and said, okay, give me what's the biggest opportunity you see for brands in our industry at the moment, Rob?
That's a good question. A biggest opportunity. I'm not saying it because Helena's here. Women's sport is an opportunity for sure. And you see the big rights owners in this country are actively promoting and spending money promoting, certainly national teams, FA, ECB, etc., are actively pushing the women's team forward, quite rightly, and it's paying dividends. Okay. So that's one.
Women's sport. So
obviously, I would echo that. I should say that on the government's Women and Sport Advisory Board, I mean, the data is very depressing. Only 0.4% of all commercial sponsorships still for women. But when you look at, as an investor, you want to buy low, sell high. And the entry point for a lot of women's sports is very attractive. And then when you look at the opportunity for growth, not just the live audience, let's include the live audience. So if you look at the media coverage, it's only 7% of all sports is on women's sports, and only 2% of that is the print. So there's a huge opportunity from where we are now. It's at a very low level. Clearly you have to pick your spots, but there's obviously big international opportunities like football.
Yeah, and one feels that the agenda is moving along. Bill?
I think, we're going through a fairly tough time at the moment. I think also quite often when you're going through a tough time, that's when a lot of great opportunities arise and come about. We haven't spoken much today about the new government strategy for sport in the nation, but there's 5 prerogatives there. There's mental well-being, physical well-being, individual development, and I think we'd all agree that done correctly, sport has a huge role to play in that. I think it's a massive opportunity for the private sector, along with the right sports and the right federations and the right sporting bodies, to engage with the public at a grassroots level to really give back some of the benefits that sport can offer. And I don't think it's really not touched yet. And I think there's a huge opportunity to partner with government to do that.
Okay. Martin?
Well, again, I don't sound like I'm just plugging what I'm involved with, but I think a lot of us commercialised established sport that are struggling for a whole variety of reasons. But I think there are some emerging sports that have the capability of being global, have the capability of really reaching out to fresh sectors of the world. So, clearly sailing. I'm still a new boy in it all, but it's it's very when you go out and see which is inherently green, it's fresh, it's new, and it's exciting. It's, you know, in the sport that I'm involved, we've got to demonstrate that we can commercialise it, we can make it global, we can get more nations participating. You know,
Sure.
we've got 6 nations at the moment, but I think this is an opportunity. I think there's a lot of other new, fresh, emerging sports. You know, there's a huge appetite out there for sport, and you know, lots of media channels are crying out for live sport, which disables people from the idea of putting it in the box and then speeding through the ads, because that's really why live sport has value. So I think all these new emerging sports have got tremendous potential.
Good. Okay, we've got 7 minutes, according to my clock. Has anybody got any questions that they'd like to ask the panel? No questions? Okay, there's a gentleman here who'd like to ask a question.
Hello, I'm from
Hi,
Anti-Doping.
just say who you are and then...
Hi there, James Bogle from UK Anti-Doping. So you've obviously, the debate about sort of funding anti-doping is one that you touched on at the beginning. And you're kind of talking about protecting integrity as well. But why wouldn't, as a sponsor sort of agency, think about maybe sponsoring something like UK's anti-doping's education program, whereby you've got an education program that's actually kind of got a positive message, kind of getting out there. So rather than kind of being kind of forced to harass to kind of provide money like to WADA or people tending to do things, kind of practically doing it in this sort of climate, because actually it's actually quite a beneficial. Would be seen to be quite a beneficial thing to do now when anti-doping is kind of hitting sports quite hard and there's a lot of negativity around it.
Rob, can I throw that one at you?
Would we advise someone to sponsor UK anti-doping? I think whether sponsoring it or funding it and actually investing it for the long term, I think there are two possibly different things. I mean, sponsorship, traditionally you're trying to leverage, emotional connections and relationships. So I can see objections in a business to doing that, but on the other hand, funding and helping fund, and it's back to the conversation or suggestion we talked about earlier about how the industry moves this area forward. That's a little bit different in terms of a funding model of some sort. Is that sponsorship or is that actually beyond that? I'm not quite sure. I can see challenges in persuading people to sponsor the UK Anti-Doping Agency, but I think if on a more collective basis, investing in those sort of things, I'd say is a different story, and it's a place that the industry has to go, in my view, yeah.
Well, they may invest in different ways,
of course,
they? Because there could be a future whereby every time there's a sponsorship deal done, contract signed, maybe a proportion of that doesn't go to the governing body with whom it's being sold, the rights holder. It goes towards funding anti-doping. That is a scenario that might happen in the future.
Totally agree.
It's been touched on before. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Mel.
Mouth Min, Strive Sponsorship. Just touching on women in sport, as we mentioned earlier, there's a tendency from rights holders to package the rights for women in with a package with the rights of men. So if you look at football clubs, for instance, often you can get rights for the women's team with the men's team. What's your opinion around the best way for rights holders to look to engage brands in women's sport, and indeed for brands to engage with women's sport?
Well, I can just speak from our own experience. In fact, it almost was the other way around for our case, that we had learned through the agency that there was no money involved at all, or no money sponsoring the women's race, and so the women had to pay for their own kit and their own transport, and it was very much an underclass. And so we, for a very small sum of money in the context of big sporting sponsorships, initially we sponsored the women, and then as that was a success the first year, some of you might have heard the story before, but Sir Steve Redgrave's daughter, Natalie Redgrave, was at Oxford. She'd never rowed before, but she was 6'2", so this is a plausible wild card. Anyway, she did start rowing, and Oxford did win. So for the princely sum of £30,000, we had the front pages of all the newspapers the next day with her wearing a Snooten shirt and her arm raised in victory. Some of my colleagues said, it's a shame we didn't give them hats. I mean, I really thought that was picking a hole in what was a great success. But then, of course, the men's race needed a sponsor, and the boat race company came to us and said, well, because the women's race has now got some attention, we're probably going to have to do the two together. And then I approached BMI Mullen and sort of, as I say, reversed engineered that one. I personally think that it's a shame to sort of immediately package the two. I do think there's a problem in terms of the sales model, as it were, used for women sports. It shows perhaps a bit of a lack of imagination that lots of women's sports approach me at Newton for sponsorship, but we've kind of done our bit perhaps, and I now pass them through to Women's Sports Trust and other bodies that might have connections with people who might be interested. But there is a story to tell, and it's somewhat underplaying the story, or often there is, if you then sort of submerge it and say, oh, it's all part of a continuum. And I think just bringing out, we've talked a lot on the panel about the emotional side, the personalities of the sports, the athletes, the connection with people. And I just feel that a lot of the time the story is not well told. It's sort of a little bit apologetic. Oh, we've got this sort of slight underclass, we'll throw that in with the men's race, That's not really going to do it, I think, in terms of lifting the bar.
But Bill, that doesn't really raise its sort of head in your terms, does it? Because I mean, in your world, men and women are very much. You wouldn't dream of getting a sponsor just for the women, would you?
That just wouldn't happen. I mean, in our case, if you look at our audience, you look at our fan base, we're actually 54% women and 46% men. So we're quite unique in the sense we've got that slight skew towards women. I mean, it's roughly half and half. If you look at Sochi, 75% of our medals were won by women. If we talk to, if you go through the names that sort of reel off the tongue when you think about London and also Tokyo, whether it's Becky Adlington, Jess Ennis, Laura Trott, Vicky Pendleton, I mean, the list of women is just as impressive, if not more impressive, than the list of men. So we tend to find that a sponsor or a potential commercial partner will come in, and it'll be very much around what's the message they want to tell around a particular athlete. And it won't necessarily be gender specific. Quite often they want a balance of the two.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you, Bill, because one of the thinkings of that government's women's sports group was that actually the promise of the Olympics, the success of the women athletes as well as the men, would then sort of unblock the sort of commercial sponsorship. And it hasn't really, in terms of, I mean, there might be individual sponsorship, but in terms of, even the women's against Germany, the football match that attracted a much bigger audience than ever before, and it seemed like it sort of damp squib afterwards. It didn't really follow through.
I think it's coming for us. I mean, women's rugby, fantastically successful, and we've got a good chance at a medal in Rio with the women's sevens team there. In our conversations with commercial partners, the piece that relates to females does come up a lot. So I think they're probably feeling that they get that, they're able to address that through one relationship. But clearly, I think there's more headroom for that, for sure.
Great things from Rio then, huh?
You can sponsor us if you like.
Well, there's lots more we could have talked about. Sadly, it says that we're run out of time. So I'd just like you to please thank our wonderful panellists and